So here we are. It's weekend 2, day 2, and just that reminder that the real reason this whole Citizens Assembly has been brought together is to look at this big question of how should democracy in the UK work? What would make a really good democracy? So the agenda for today, shortly, we're going to give you the opportunity to check in with the group you're going to be working with, because you're going to be in new groups today. Which is great because you started having all the conversations yesterday. Hopefully every group had a slightly different conversation. Every group called in some of the speakers and learned different things from them. So when you come together in new groups, the idea is that hopefully you'll be able to sort of share some of those different perspectives that you had. But really then we're going to be focusing on that big question we started with yesterday of what limits, if any, should be placed on what a democratically elected government can do. In the second part of the morning, we're going to be thinking about how, I suppose, actually how these different types of limits on government powers can or should be applied. And towards the end of the day, we're going to towards the end of the morning, we're going to be thinking again about the principles that you think really should underpin a good democracy. And just to give you a kind of heads up that actually looking forward, we do have a plan. In weekend 3, we're going to be going and really focusing in on the roles of sort of government and parliament. So the things that were touched on in the morning yesterday. In weekend 4, we're going to be taking that deeper dive into the role of the public and others. So we've talked about sort of media and lobbyists and other interest groups in terms of their role in government. Weekend 5, we're going to really focus on that idea of the rights and norms and behaviours, so the whole kind of legal framework, but also other types of bodies and regulatory bodies that can play a role in ensuring that government works most effectively. And then weekend 6, we're going to bring it all together, and it'll be the chance for really you as the Assembly members to answer that big question about, how should democracy in the UK work and work well. So before I let you go into your groups today, I just want to remind you of where we were at the end of the first weekend. So as some of you will remember, at the end of the first weekend, we started to talk about, well, what are the emerging principles? What are the types of principles, the things, the values, whatever words you use, that actually should and could underpin this idea of a good democracy? And so in your groups, you might remember at the end of the first weekend, you started to really tie down and prioritize some of the things that seemed really important to that. So what we've done is go across the 11 groups and draw out the things that came out across the 11 groups and some of the things that were coming out in common. So the first one that came out when we reviewed all of the notes from that were, in a good democracy, there needs to be fair representation. And that was something that came out for a lot of people there, that the people who are elected are actually representing the views of the people who elected them, and that decisions that are made in a good democracy are driven by this idea of we the people. And as Alan was talking about yesterday, that fundamental, I suppose, position of democracy, that actually it is the people that are driving the decisions. The second one was about free and inclusive elections. And that was something that was valued by a lot of people, so that actually that everyone can participate, regardless of their background or status in society, and most importantly, have their vote count equally. And there was a lot of debate around that in different groups about what age, because some parts of the country we have votes that people from 16 can vote. In other parts of the country, it's not that case. In some parts of the country, there's sort of debates around whether, people who are prisoners, for example, were allowed to vote, but actually the principle overall that everyone is able to participate seemed important to you. Third one there was systems of accountability and redress. And by redress, we really mean that idea of being able to put something right, change. So that idea that politicians, and it was particularly emphasized as politicians, who are seen as doing a poor job, are able to be challenged and replaced if needed outside of the election cycle without having to wait for 5 years to be able to vote someone out again, so that people have confidence in the people who are actually making decisions on their behalf. Fourth one was actually the fourth principle that seemed to emerge from all your conversations, was that idea about there needing to be limits on the influence of the already powerful. Now, various groups identified who those sort of already powerful were, whether it was lobbyists, whether it was the press, whether it was the sort of the rich or the habitually powerful, the people who are used to being listened to. But that idea that there needed to be limits on that, so that there was not people in society that had undue or overly able to influence government decisions. Another one that came up in a lot of the groups was this idea that no unelected bodies should be making political or policy decisions. Now, in some groups, that was really focusing on the House of Lords and the fact that, many of them, well, all of them are appointed, and particularly some of the hereditary peers in the House of Lords, as we talked about yesterday. But also there was a real emphasis in some groups around the idea that in a good democracy, officials or public servants should not be the ones making decisions. It has to be that, there was an emphasis on making sure that the people who were elected by the people to represent their views were the ones who were actually making decisions. Another one that came up was that there needed to be, and this is a bit different because it's actually about the public itself, that there is a need to be an informed and educated voter base, so that actually we as the public are making our choices based on clear, verifiable, honest, accessible information, but actually have taken that initiative to know what we're choosing. And then the final one there was, final one on this slide, is that idea of respect for the results of a vote. That even if actually, people don't get the win that they wanted, that, there is respect that a vote or a decision has been made by a majority and therefore is able to be delivered on. H, so the next one here was about a principle about in a good democracy, there needs to be diversity in our elected representatives. And that was talked about in a number of groups, so that parliaments and governments are actually representative of the electorate as a whole and representative of the population. And there was some question raised in many of the groups about whether that was the case at the moment. The next one that came up was that an ideal that in a good democracy, ministers are actually knowledgeable about their policy areas, so that ministers have a responsibility for things that they actually are educated in, know about, can help make good decisions, so that the public can have faith that the recommendations ministers are making or the decisions that are being taken are actually based on good evidence. One that came up quite a lot, and just to say these are in no particular order, they're because they're in no particular order. This is not a sort of list of priority. They're actually honesty in politics. And I think most of you will remember that came up in all of the discussions there. So that idea that, there is able to have a level of trust in the people that have been elected and have confidence and faith in the system. And honesty was seen as fundamental by most of the groups in terms of enabling the public to have that confidence. Transparency in decision-making. was another one that was really emphasized, so that even if you as a member of the public or other parties don't necessarily agree in the decision that's been made, can see and understand how decisions have been made and the rationale behind them, even if you might not agree. So next one there, in a good democracy, that idea of rules of law that apply equally to everyone. So there's real emphasis there that, the rules, the things that are in place to try and, monitor how decisions are made, how government operates, actually is really important, that these are applied to everyone, and that there are those clear sort of lines and distinctions between church, state, judiciary. That was all raised in different groups. So, and that idea of reducing the opportunities to abuse power or corrupt practices. And then M, respect for the fundamental human rights of all people. So it was something that was raised, it was touched on in a couple of groups, that government should not be able to kind of willfully discriminate or create rules that systematically are prejudiced against certain aspects of society. And it's something I know that came up in a lot of the discussions yesterday as well. Okay, the other one that came up quite strongly in weekend one was that commitment from elected governments to be able to deliver on their manifesto, so that the promises made are actually delivered. And I know that's something that people were debating and questioning yesterday, so there might need to be some sort of limits or some considerations put on this, but it was definitely something that at the end of weekend one, people felt quite strongly needed to be a part of a good democracy. This idea of power sharing also was raised, and by power sharing, it was about those sort of coalitions and trying to sort of work for different parties working together, so that actually the interests of all are taken into account and decisions are made that actually are for the good of the people as a whole. And I think the last one there that came up at the end of last week was this idea of freedom of thought and speech. So that actually in a good democracy, there is space for different views, that not only are they, allowed to have them, but actually are welcomed and recognized and part of the sort of public discussion. And so the public has that ability to question and, if necessary, protest, to actually create the types of changes, the types of world that they want to live in. So that was just a bit of a recap. And the reason I wanted to do that this morning was, before we go back into the discussions, I wanted to kind of remind people of where they were and what they were thinking was important at the end of weekend one, because actually it all ties together when we start thinking about what limits, if any, should be placed on what a democratically elected government can actually do. So that was a bit of a recap of where you were. We're going to come back to some of those principles at the end of the day, but I wanted to put them back in your head to, before you start the conversation, to remind you of some of the other things that aren't just about the limits, the constraints, the kind of rules that we need to put in place, but also the aspirations of what will be, what could be a good democracy. Looks like we've got everyone back, so good. Now, I know I promised you yesterday that there was no sort of new information today, no kind of presentations, no new information that you had to sort of absorb and try and fit in. And I still say I'm wrong. I still say I was telling the truth, but we do have a very short presentation now just to help frame the next conversation. But again, it's not new information. It's just bringing back some of the ways we've been thinking about how some of the constraints or the limits that you might want to impose on what a democratically elected government is able to do could actually be delivered in practice. So although it's all stuff that sort of came up yesterday, we've just asked Alan to speak for a couple of minutes now about who are the actors? Who are the different people or the different institutions that actually have a role in enforcing or putting in place some of the limits that we've been talking about? So I'll hand over to Alan now, just for a few moments.
Great, thank you, Kayla, and good morning again, everyone. Great to see you again. So as Kayla said, I'm very much not going to be saying anything new that hasn't already been said, but it's helpful just to organize some of our thoughts on some of these things as we move the discussion forward. So we've been exploring this question, what limits, if any, should be placed on what a democratically elected government can do. And very closely related to that question is a kind of next question on, so how should any limits, if we do think there should be limits on governments, how should they be enforced? So we thought it would be helpful just to pull together some of the ways in which any limits on government might be enforced at this stage in the discussion. So one obvious limit that you might have in mind is, well, voters at election time can very clearly limit government in that they can decide to get rid of one government and elect a different government instead. So that's in a sense a very strong limit. On the other hand, it's a limit that only comes up every few years. So it's a pretty kind of blunt instrument for most of the time. Kind of similar in a way is voting in referendums. So that's a way in which voters can impose a particular decision on a specific question. But again, we don't have referendums very often in the UK. You might think we should have more referendums, but a lot of people are worried about referendums and whether they're really a good way of making decisions. So if we want to think about ways in which we can have kind of day-to-day limits on what governments do, then perhaps we should be thinking more about limits that are introduced through public discussion and media discussion, like a day-to-day talk about politics. So politicians are very concerned about the opinion polls, about whether what they're doing is popular or not. They don't like to have negative media headlines. So, what gets discussed in the public through the media and just how we're talking about policy decisions actually does feed through quite a lot into what governments do. And I mean, I've said discussion there, but obviously there are also mechanisms for trying to put pressure on government through signing petitions, writing to your MP, taking part in demonstrations, all the kinds of things that Anand was talking about in his presentation yesterday. On the other hand, we might be worried that who has the loudest voice in the media isn't necessarily representative of wider public opinion. So if we want to have a more sort of representative process of discussion about what government should be doing, then maybe we need to turn to our representatives. And there we have Parliament. So Parliament is, at least in a sense, representative of the wider public. And also Parliament actually has veto power on what the government does. So Parliament is able to say no to the government, that you're not able to do a particular thing. So those are all sorts of political, if you like, mechanisms of putting limits on the government. They all involve us and elections and our elected representatives and all of that kind of political process. We also talked about limits that are outside that political process. So the role of the courts might be important in enforcing legal rules and making sure that those in power are not overstepping the boundaries. But equally, we might be concerned that the courts can be a bit of a kind of sledgehammer to crack a nut sometimes. So Michael, in his presentation yesterday, talked also about the role of officials and so-called watchdogs and ombudspeople. So organizations that are charged with looking into what politicians and others in power are doing and offering advice as to whether they might be overstepping the boundaries, and sometimes having powers to enforce kind of codes of practice and that kind of thing as well. So those are a few ideas, and you might have some other ideas about the sorts of mechanisms through which limits could be enforced. So it was interesting, for example, yesterday that some of the questions that you were asking were about whether it should be possible for people to force the government to hold a public inquiry, for example, or force the government's hand in various other ways. So you might think there are other mechanisms that are important here, but of course it's always the case that there are also arguments against having these kinds of mechanisms too, that it's important for us to consider. So those are a few possible limits. And I just wanted also just to give some examples. So the difficult bit is thinking about, okay, so we've got these ways in which we could enforce limits. And then we had, as you've been discussing this morning, all of those kinds of limits that we might want. So what's the relationship between these two different sets of things? How can we relate these two things to each other? So some of these ways of enforcing limits are kind of naturally come out of the nature of the limit itself. So one of the limits was H. Some basic questions should be decided directly by the people rather than by government and parliament. So that's quite closely related, obviously, to the idea of having referendums. There are, of course, other ways in which people could be involved, but referendums are at least one obvious way. Other limits, by contrast, are perhaps associated with several different mechanisms. So we have talked about certain basic rights should be protected. And many people would say it's absolutely fundamental, if we want to have rights protection, that that is a role for the courts, that we want to take that out of the political process, out of the process where majorities can often impose their will and perhaps go against the rights of minorities. But on the other hand, many people would say, well, that's taking really important decisions, policy decisions, out of the political process, the process that we as voters are ultimately in charge of. So perhaps instead there should be a fundamental role for Parliament in protecting rights. And indeed, many MPs would see themselves as having a very important role in protecting rights and liberties. And Parliament has a committee that looks specifically into human rights issues. But people might also say that, well, unless you have a kind of culture that supports people's rights, then ultimately it's going to be difficult to ensure that those rights really are well protected. So maybe we need rights protection to come through how we discuss politics and talk about policy issues more broadly. So you can start to see there that actually sometimes some of these limits might best be enforced by various different bits of the democratic system kind of working together rather than just having one bit of the system doing all the hard work. I'll just give you a couple more examples to chew over. So one of the limits was there should be space for public comment and criticism of changes before they happen. So an obvious place for public discussion and criticism is public and media discussion. And that can be very, very important. On the other hand, as I said, sometimes there are powerful voices in the media that aren't necessarily representative of the wider public. So that idea of having a representative body able to have that the public comment and criticism may be important. So that gives a role for Parliament. Of course, there are other kinds of representative body potentially, such as citizens' assemblies, and you might think that they are important as well. And then just finally, policymakers should have to operate within agreed standards of good behavior. So here again, the courts might have an important role. If we want to have standards of not giving government contracts in a corrupt way, then that's kind of something that you might obviously want the courts to be doing. On the other hand, if we want standards of honesty, Kayla talked about how important that was in your discussions last weekend, that politicians are honest. Do we really want the courts deciding whether a politician is speaking the truth or not? That could get very contentious and difficult. So maybe there's more of a role for independent watchdogs that can advise on these issues, or maybe there's more of a role simply for the public in making judgments and holding politicians to account at elections. But again, of course, that is something that happens only every few years. So again, Parliament might have an important role in having that kind of open, ongoing discussion. So those are just some thoughts from me, and I will finish there and hand back to Kayla.
Hey, thank you, Alan. So again, what you're going to be doing very shortly is going back and thinking about some of the limits that you're thinking are important, the types of things that really would help us have a good or the best democracy we can, and thinking about, well, what would that mean in practice? How would those limits be employed? What is the balance of the kind of responsibility of some of these different actors, these different players, different institutions? But before we start that conversation, we're going to give you all a break time to sort of top up teas, coffees, grab a snack, whatever you need to do. And we're going to open up the breakout rooms during that time. So when you come back, ready to start again at 11:15. So just 10 minutes break, 11:15, you'll be in your breakout rooms and ready to start that discussion. And we'll see you after that. Hopefully you've enjoyed and it's been useful having that time in your breakout rooms to really focus in on that big question about, what limits, if any, should be placed on what an elected government can do, and how would that work in practice. We'll be coming back to some of these questions. These are the early conversations when we start looking at the particular structures in terms of, governments and parliaments, role of the public, the role of courts and other kind of regulatory authorities. We'll be coming back to these questions, but this is starting to build up what's the feeling within the room? And that's what we've been doing this morning. So the last thing we're going to ask you to do before we finish up today is really go back to where you were with the principles, these ideas of these emerging principles of what fundamentally feels like it would make for a good democracy. So we're just going to ask you to spend the last bit of the morning focusing in on looking back at where you were at the end of the last weekend and what had come out collectively across the 11 groups, but also going, do some of these maybe feel more important now or less important? Are there conditions or some additions you'd want to add to these ideas of how they would form a good democracy? Or are there things that have come up over the discussions in the last sort of 2 days that actually we hadn't thought of at the end of the last time we met, that need to be added to this list of emerging principles? So when you go back into the breakout rooms, the facilitators have a bit of a summary, a recap of the emerging principles that I presented to you all this morning to sort of put them back into your head. And there'll be an opportunity to start thinking about, well, which ones seem like they really would add value or add the most value to a good democracy. So we're going to send you back into the breakout rooms and we will see you again just before we finish up at 12:30. This looks like almost everyone's back. Breakout rooms are all now closed, and thank you for joining us today. That's it. We've come to the end of the second weekend. So hopefully you're starting to feel that you're getting your head around both the range of the topics we're going to be looking at, but also the complexity there that we can, that are things we're going to have to work through over the next 4 weekends. So as you can see, there's going to be quite a lot there that we're going to have to cover, but we've got a plan. As we said earlier, we're going to be sort of taking a deeper dive into each of the topics over the next 3 weekends. And then towards the end, we'll bring it all back together.
So this weekend and the previous weekend, actually, we've been kind of exploring around the democratic system as a whole and getting your early ideas on how democracy in the UK does work and how it might work better. In the next 3 weekends, as Kayla said, we're going to be going into more detail on particular bits of the system and starting to reach some actual kind of draft recommendations of the Citizens' Assembly. So we'll be moving on next weekend to looking at the heart of power, if you like, Parliament and government and how they work and how they relate to each other. So that's what's coming up next weekend. But just thank you from me for another fantastic weekend. I've been dropping into the groups. You've all been working really hard, really interesting conversations going on. So I really look forward to seeing you again in just 2 weeks' time. And back to Kayla for final words.
And really all I have to say again is thank you. Thank you again. Hopefully you're enjoying it. I'm really looking forward to going through some of the notes and Jamboards and pulling out some of the insights that you've made there, and we'll bring some of that back to you in future weekends. So again, thank you. We do try and really finish on time, so anyone who does want to get away can get away, and then anyone who does have any sort of questions or points they want to make, then feel free to stay and we can take those now. But if you're keen to get away, do enjoy your afternoon.